Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really happy to welcome you to the official Tunisian side event at COP26. Bonsoir, mesdames, messieurs. Je suis heureux à vous accueillir pour l'événement officiel tunisien à la COP de Glasgow. So this event will discuss raising ambition to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. It's an event that builds around the Tunisian strategies, the long-term strategies that have been developed, and it will discuss those strategies in the light of experiences of other countries. Well, we are happy that we have representatives from Jordan and India who can give a reflection of how the Tunisian strategies relate to the strategies of their own countries. And I'm also, of course, extremely happy that we have with us Amal Riden from Global Shapers, because this event is a co-production between the government of Tunisia and the organization. Donc, je suis vraiment heureux d'accueillir le panel qui consiste des experts de la Jordanie et de l'Inde, et aussi naturellement notre partenaire de l'événement, l'association Global Shapers. So I will start with setting the scene. I will first go into the question, where do we stand with regard of the global ambition? What is the situation regarding net zero commitments? Then, of course, this gaping gap between the NDCs and the net zero pathways, and then get into the side event agenda. So it seems that now the slides have disappeared, so let me just still keep the discussion going. Yeah, thank you very much. So on this slide you see, of course, the statement which has been provided by many institutions, last but not least the emission gap report of UNEP that was released last week, that emissions have been increasing historically. They would have to go down very fast to enable us to reach the 1.5 degree target, a bit slower, but still much faster than historical experience shows for the 2 degree target. And you see the blue shape, that is what we see with the current policies that would bring us to a warming of about 2.7 degrees as per the latest estimates. And this here is the figure that was provided by the UNFCCC Secretariat in the synthesis report on the NDCs that shows the size and scale of the gap. Of course, we have seen quite a movement in net zero targets in the very recent past. By September 2021, we had about 50 countries that had pledged such targets. But just last week, there were a number of interesting newcomers from the Arab Peninsula. And now, during the high-level segment, this has been joined by really large players, of course, foremost India. And of course, I'm happy that we have an Indian representative with us with the net zero target for 2070. Also, a big African country, actually the African giant Nigeria. And also Vietnam being a large country as well. So there have been some rough estimates that about 11% of global emissions are now not covered by net zero, which would of course mean quite a movement in a very short time. The big problem is, and I hope we'll be able to discuss it, is that most of these net zero pledges are rather vague and they are not really reflected in the context of the current NDCs. So just a few pictures here regarding big countries. So you see, of course, for example, for China, the target is really tough. China wants to have emissions peaking in 2030. But then needs to really turn the tables massively to reach the net zero 2060. We have the same for Brazil. So of course, yeah, how do we bend that we get to a pathway which is really manageable? And of course, this is also reflected in the NDC tracker, where of course you see a lot of black, red, yellow colors, and you see one green color, and it's a tiny country in Africa, the Gambia, which doesn't really make a difference in terms of global emissions. So I would like to mention one approach that we have developed recently in our research at Perspectives and the University of Zurich, which relates to the international carbon markets, and where we want to align the international carbon markets with net zero pathways. And we propose that there should be a so-called ambition coefficient. That means we have a multiplier that is reduced over time as per the pathway the country would have to achieve to get to a sensible net zero situation. So that would mean the emission credits that this country can get through the carbon markets would decline over time. And we hope that such proposal, which of course needs to be differentiated between countries according to the principle of CBDRC, that this is being brought into the discussion about international carbon markets. But now let me focus on the event today. So we will start with the Tunisian approach. You see, we will build this event, of course, around what Tunisia has been achieving in the context of the updated NDC and its long-term strategy. And this will then subsequently be followed by the reflections from Jordan. I'm very happy that we have Bilal Shkarin from the Ministry of Environment of Jordan with us, and then followed by Arjun Dutt from the Council of Energy, Environment and Water in India. That's a really flourishing think tank doing very highly relevant policy analysis and of course having very close interactions with the policymakers. And then last but not least, given that civil society plays a crucial role in actually enabling political decisions on net zero targets and the implementation of the policy instruments, Amal Riden. And I hope that we'll be able to have question and answers. I know that the platform that is provided by the Secretariat is a bit challenging, but I'm looking forward to receiving virtual questions. And yeah, with that, let me turn to Mohamed Smerli, who will give the introduction on behalf of the Ministry of Environment, the Tunisian focal point. Mohamed, you have the floor. La parole à vous. Yeah, the virtual presentation should roll. I hope that they are online and can join. Yeah, but they need. So,
hello, everybody.
Très bien, on vous attend. Please proceed.
Is it okay?
Yes. Oui, on peut démarrer. Okay, let's hope that we'll be able to get Tunisia online. So maybe we can use the opportunity. Yeah? Sorry for that slight delay, which is linked to the bandwidth. Well, maybe let me fill the time with some personal views, I've been now working in Maghreb region for 20 years, and Maghreb actually, among all the Middle Eastern countries, has been the most forward-looking countries in the context of climate policy. And clearly the front runners are Tunisia and Morocco. And despite all the challenges that Tunisia has faced regarding the political, economic and pandemic situation, Tunisia has really been steadfast. It has not wavered on its commitment to address climate change. I think it is really a good example to show how over the years sufficient capacity has been built, first in the context of the Kyoto Protocol, also in the context of the mechanisms that the Kyoto Protocol has been applying in the Tunisian context, like the Clean Development Mechanism, where Tunisia was one of the early movers in the African context, also in the context of the nationally appropriate mitigation actions, where Tunisia developed a wide range of very well structured NAMAs in the renewable energy sector, in the waste sector, in the energy efficiency sector, which were critical basis for actually enabling the setting up of the NDC, and without which it would not have been possible to set up the long-term strategy, which hopefully we'll be able to discuss. At least I see my good friend and colleague Samir on the camera. Yeah, so now we see Samir even large. I just hope that Samir can speak to us.
I hope so, because
yes.
I have been trying to make my presentation, but
yes.
I was disconnected, so I will be trying again. Hopefully it will. Yes, hopefully it will work.
Yes.
Let me try. Yes, I hope that it will go until the end. So is it okay?
We see you, Samia, but not the slides.
And now?
Yes, we hear you. So, Samir, if you hear me,
you see this?
Just start talking, yes. And we have to hope that the technical team gets the slide up and running. Samia, please just start talking.
Okay, so do you see my slides now?
Okay, good. So it seems we have to operate the slides from our side. You can't do it from your side, so please talk, yes, and I will operate.
Okay.
Yes.
So please do it, because it's better. Otherwise, I will have more problems.
Please come. We hear you.
So is it okay?
The floor is yours. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. And my PowerPoint is
yes.
on the screen now.
Yes, visible.
Okay. So thank you. Okay, so thank you for giving me the floor and this opportunity to talk about the Tunisian experience in preparing long-term strategy, long-term emissions strategy for year 2050. I'm going to make a presentation first, starting with describing the approach that we use it in developing long-term strategy. Second point, Tunisia's NDC ambition and long-term vision. And then third, lesson learned and key messages that we could provide after such interesting experience. So the work was launched by Ministry of Environment of Tunisia in mid-November 2020 with GIZ support. And we are expecting a final workshop to take place on 7 and 8 December 2021, so the next month. Duration of the whole study was 13 months, or would be 13 months. And we would have two main deliverables. The first had many deliverables, in fact, but the final deliverable, the first one, would be the long-term low emission strategy for 2050, and the second final deliverable would be Tunisia long-term strategy and resilience to climate change strategy document, which covers both low emission strategy and resilience strategy. And the document will be hopefully submitted to UNFCCC Secretariat before the end of this year. So in terms of approach in the long-term strategy development, first of all IPCC sector were involved in this long-term strategy. We have to know that preparation of long-term strategy for energy sector started earlier in 2019, involving a complex modelization work using NRMED model, and it included also socio-economic scenario development. And we started the work for the other sectors in November 2020 with industrial processes, which is a mix of we developed a mix of specifically designed modelization spreadsheet for cement, nitric acid, and also we've been using IPCC spreadsheet for HFCs. For the AFOLU sector, we also used a mix of specifically designed modelization spreadsheet with Excel for bottom-up modeling and use of exact model. This is a FEO model to cross-check between bottom-up and the exact top-down modeling approach. And third, waste, we also used a mix of specifically designed modelization spreadsheet using Excel for wastewater treatment and use of IPCC spreadsheet, which were originally designed by IPCC for GHG inventory for solid waste, but we used it as a forecasting model up to year 2050 for this solid waste sector. In terms of approach adopted, we also fully based our approach on consultative process, despite the COVID constraints in the year 2020. And the consultative process is necessary to ensuring ownership of the results. And we organized large workshops involving all sector, but also sectoral workshop, sectoral consultation meetings, and sectoral validation meetings. So we did all the approaches available to go into the field with the sector in order to ensure ownership of the final work. We had 5 steps involved in this study. First step, it was a stock taking phase. We tried to reconstitute the GHG trajectories and achievement for the period 2015 up to period 2020. Second steps involved determination of the vision up to year 2050. The vision were to be consistent with Tunisian development priorities while meeting Paris Agreement goals. Third steps involved sectoral perspective work, including impact assessment and the national compilation of the whole sector's work. Fourth step involved finalization of long-term strategy, including additional iteration with sectors. And
it seems we have lost Samir, so unless we get him back quickly, I might take over. Good. So now with regard to the NDC, the Tunisian NDC update was submitted in October 2021. So the ambition has increased. The initial NDC in 2015 had a target of emission intensity reduction, that's important, of 41%, and now the target has been increased to 45% decrease of intensity. And there has now been a more finely grained assessment of the emission reduction potential underpinning the NDC. And of course, there is now a clear vision of peaking emissions and coming to an absolute downward trending path. So here you see the trajectory, that's again in intensity terms. So one sees here the 45% reduction in intensity. You also see the challenges that we have seen in Tunisia due to the economic crisis, then the pandemic, that the intensity has increased, which is natural if you have a decrease in the economic the overall economic production. And here we have the various trajectories. So you see the blue dotted line, business as usual. Then there is a low carbon scenario of the first NDC 2015, the gray line, and now there is the red line, and this is now absolute terms. So you see the peaking of emissions in Tunisia will be achieved under this updated NDC. Now, when we look into the long-term vision, which of course is the 2050 time horizon, so you see here again, this is absolute emissions, it's not emissions intensity. That over the decade 2020 to 2030, the emissions start to fall, and then this fall accelerates significantly. You also see the green element. Good, Samia's back. Samir, I have now continued to slide number 19, so please take over again. We are
okay, so I leave the screen. I leave the screen, so maybe it's better for connection.
Good. So yeah, you close your camera, and we are on slide number 19. So please continue on slide number 19.
Okay. So so these are the results of the prospective work, which shows the that the action will continue beyond 2030. And you see the deceleration rate of emission, but you also see that there is an acceleration of the downward trend of net emission from now to 2030. And also during the development of the prospective work, we largely try to cover all lung emission reduction possibilities. So as you can see, for all the 4 sectors involved, we have a decrease in the emission in absolute terms, but also a great increase in net absorption of the AFOLU sector. So next. So here it shows also the both the 2 trajectories, business as usual, which is in red, and a transitional scenario, which is in blue. It shows that emission in absolute terms would be decreased by 13 times as compared to the business as usual if we go through the low carbon scenario. And it will be also a decrease, 6-time decrease in emissions in absolute term as compared to 2020. So it is a very significant effort of reducing emissions of the whole economy based on very significant effort in the 4 sectors. Next. So all sectors have been considering sharp and continuous drops in emissions and rise, of course, in absorption rate for AFOLU sector. As you can see here, for the energy sector, the emission in absolute term will be decreased by 3 times as compared to business as usual, 6 times for the industrial processes. It will increase by 3 times for AFOLU sector, and it will decrease by 2 times as compared to the business as usual in the waste sector. No, sorry, I wanted to just add point in the previous one. As you can see, there is a very important decrease in emission in absolute terms at a national level, and we are really very close to the neutrality, to the net neutrality in year 2050. And this is why we are intending to have a last iteration round with the sector. We are going to launch it next week to consider an additional increase in ambition for each of the sectors in order to try to reach the net emission neutrality. There are some rooms for increasing ambition. In fact, if we consider, for example, accelerated technological maturity in future energy innovation like hydrogen or renewable energy, accelerate waste recovery measures, and larger land coverage in absorption measures. So if we consider these, we may be able to announce neutrality for 2050, but we need first to interact further with the sector to be sure that they will agree to go ahead with these new trajectories. So next. So what are the key messages after this very interesting experience of developing long-term strategy? First of all, developing long-term strategy for emission reduction should be based on a full consultative process as to ensure ownership. The LTS must involve a real transitional process that breaks with the past. We don't have to implement an exercise based on business as usual, but we need to have real ambitions. First of all, we need to track down all greenhouse gas existing mitigation possibilities. Also, from the start of the process, we have a real prospective vision of the integration of technological innovation, including those promising which are still in the teething stage. Otherwise, we can no longer have a real ambition for 2050. And to some extent, the transitional cost may have not be to be considered as a decisive factor, because the transition will cost a lot anyway. We know we are aware of that, but we need to imagine that the cost of inaction is generally much higher. And this is why we consider that the Paris Agreement financial mechanism should and will remove the financial barrier, so that the barrier would not will not go against ambitions. Third key message, adopting neutrality for 2050 target should be seen as an opportunity. It's not an engagement, it's rather an opportunity. It allows to build a real long-term vision, therefore providing for actors to having more visibility on the future. It definitely changed development model and vision, and this is what many developing countries are looking for a long time now, and Tunisia is also willing to reconsider the development models, and the neutrality could offer opportunity to go ahead with this new model. Also, it's important for a country like Tunisia to be one of the first movers in adopting climate-friendly technological innovation like hydrogen, renewable, sustainable mobility, waste recovery technology, and implementing new industrial application of these innovations. So, in one word, Tunisia could anticipate and invest in future growth, employment, and development sector if it adopt neutrality for 2050. Also, fourth point, we also consider putting the rural areas, agriculture, ecosystem back at the heart of the development. They have been somehow neglected in the existing development model, and we need to go back to this area by injecting resources and anchoring seriously it to the national development dynamics while increasing its contribution to the neutrality target through increasing the absorption capacity, as you can see in the results that I have been presenting. We, at the fifth point, need to emphasize on inclusive development, prioritizing gender, local, region youth. These were one of the problems that were involved in the previous development model. So next. Sixth point, it is also an opportunity to initiate intensive, supportive regional partnership with countries and entities that are pursuing neutrality target, like European Union, but also other countries in the region that are willing to go ahead with neutrality target for 2050. And then we can have cooperative initiatives that leave much more chance for success to a country like Tunisia, but also contribute for more chances to succeed for the whole countries in the region, including European Union region. Seventh point, it gives an opportunity to play a regional leadership and influencing role for Tunisia by announcing neutrality target for 2050. And last point, one of the pillars of countries' economic recovery would be announcing neutrality target, especially after COVID parentheses in the economic growth of the country. So it was the last point. Thank you very much. Hope that it was clear enough despite the connection problem, and hope that this will serve other experiences in other countries.
Thank you very much, Samir. And I hope that the audience could get the slides. I heard that some apparently couldn't get them, but yeah, I think it was very clear. And with that, I would now like to invite Bilal Shkarin to give the mirror from the Jordanian perspective. Bilal, you have the floor.
And thank the audience being with us even online. Good evening to all. Well, we've started in Jordan, not to jump up into a long-term strategy, but before that we are trying to roadmap what's the recommendation and what do we need with a long-term strategy for 2050. Can we go next, please? Okay. Well, the aim and objectives of the long-term strategy is that the first NDCs for Jordan, it was to reduce 14% by 2030, and then we've doubled, even more than doubled those prior to the COP26, and we've submitted that to the UNFCCC. In order to do that, we need lots of things. Jordan, as a country, we do not participate in the emission, the global stocktake, more than 0.06% of the global stocktake. But within that issue, we are always doing our action as if we were the main emitters of the whole emissions of the world. So that's what we are trying to do it, nonetheless. So the government of Jordan, within its commitment, also we've developed a green growth action plan for several of the main 6 main sectors, which is for energy, water, transport, urbanization, health, and tourism, and all of those has to be well addressed also within our LTS, so that we can reach the low emissions during 2050. Well, those actions, it will be, and our NDCs, it will be delivered 2030, at the same year that we are going to deliver also the SDGs of Jordan. So the long-term strategy, it aims for much more longer years, and what are we going to do after 2030, and how are we going to do it as a pathway. Please, next. Thank you. Well, creating the long-term vision of Jordan. Next, please. Well, the matter is that happily we do have the political will to go and move forward to paradigm shift, the transition of everything and every sector within the sources of power and energy, within the transition of the e-mobility and things like that, and also the transition of the way of thinking and the green jobs between all of the economical sectors and economical development that we do have it. And also our green growth action plans and our NDC action plan, it was emphasized and it was addressed by the Prime Minister to all sectors in order to be mainstreamed in their development plans for each sector. So the most important element of doing an LTS is how to reflect our vision and how to reach that vision within the situation. Well, if I'm talking too fast, please slow me down, but this is what I'm used to. Well, within studying a long-term strategy, we should discuss and put the social benefits, the development goals. We should detail every detail for the adaptation, mitigation. We should study the compatibility within the international context. What is there? What's the new technologies? And also what is the aiding that we can receive it, and what can we rely on? What's the long-term focusings and the alignment with the recent and the current strategies, and where are the gaps and where is the defaults in our regime that in each sector that we would like to fill, and we would like to fill it, whether it was for deregulation itself, policies, or whether it was for the infrastructure. Please to the next. Well, within creating the long-term strategy vision, we are also integrating the existing vision and strategies which exist in Jordan, whether it was in the sectors of agriculture, water, energy, transportation, and all of the other related sectors within that, and within the citizens as stakeholders and their engagement concentrating. By the way, Jordan updated this year our climate change policy, and within our climate change policy we've concentrated to mainstream the engagement of youth, the engagement of gender, and the engagement of everybody as a stakeholder in the whole loop of climate change, whether it was the creating the plans, whether it was the creating the decisions, and in taking the decisions for the country itself. So this is for the citizenships and things like related to within the tools, modalities, and quantitative informations. We've worked within the data and how we've collected that data. Recently, we've published our second biennial update report, and we've created our MRV system, which is the monitoring, reporting, and verification system, in line with a new sister system, which is the greenhouse gas registry system, in order to have the whole data within that issue. Please, next. Well, studying the national circumstances and what do we have in Jordan. Jordan yani, suffers of lots of sectors. The main sector that we are suffering from, we do have the scarcity of water. It was during 1946, it was the share of water for each capita. It was about 3,600 cubic meter per capita per year, but we are now less than 100 cubic meter per capita per year, so we are suffering so much from the scarcity of water, and we are concentrating to adapt within this sector, and within that adaptation we are trying to inject the renewables within the work of the whole strategies. The same we are talking about the other sectors. Each sector we've took the gaps, and we are trying to fill it in a compatible way that we can reach the best for it. Next, please. Okay. And also within that we are trying to create the governance and the regime of climate change in the country, and how are we going to make the institutional arrangement. Within that we are creating now the digital data banks for climate change and for the whole figures. When we talk about the digital data banks for climate change, it doesn't as you know, and everybody knows, climate change is verified and distributed for lots of sectors. Okay, so lots of sectors in order to be available to all. Please, let's go for the next slide. Okay. And within the, which I've mentioned it before, the most important thing is that the engagement of citizenship and all of population of Jordan in all of their classes. Please, next. The stakeholder engagement, it's a very important issue. It will be via the Parliament Council of Jordan, via the media, via development, via academia and universities and schools, via the civil society and the NGOs, via the business, private sector, and all of those. Please, to the next. To the next, please. Thank you. The integration of cross-cutting priorities within all sectors in order to make each sector relies on the other, and all as compatible as for a one target. Please, next. Within that we are concentrating within the alignment between the suggested climate pillars within the SDGs, because we are talking about mostly the food security, the water security. We are talking about preventing the degradation of our ecosystem, and helping the youth to find green jobs, to find the education. All of those 17 SDGs are in line within the climate change and within the policies or the targets, the long-term strategies for climate change. Please, next. And also we are recapping the implementation steps. Please, next. Okay. Well, how are we going to do it? We are going to secure the political will of the country, and we have the highest political will of the country, and we have the support of His Majesty the King for climate change and for developing new plans within the green growth and climate change. We're gonna define our objectives, then the elements, then to collect our inputs, then to communicate within the strategy and transparency within all, then to establish and review the revision, the long-term strategy, which will be revised publicly and will be taken into consideration of all allied entities. Next, please. Well, the LTS, the long-term strategy, is a key role to move toward a low emission economy, and we have to actively involve citizens and stakeholders, and within that we're gonna do some inclusive, participatory, and for the long-term vision and the pathway for all of the sectors, how to be developed within a low carbon emissions in order to implement and ensure the succession of the NDCs of the country and the commitment to climate change. Next, please.
We're done. Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Shkarin. And without further ado, I would like to pass on to Arjun Dutt.
Thank you, Axel. All right, I'll begin then.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Axel. So in my presentation today, I will try and unpack what the net zero means for sectoral decarbonization pathways in India, and also briefly touch upon the policy implications thereof. These implications could also have relevance for other developing countries, such as Tunisia. At the same time, the long-term emissions reduction strategy, as discussed by Samir and also as discussed by Bilal for Jordan, could also offer lessons for India now that it has recently announced a 2070 net zero target at COP earlier a few days ago. So before we get started, just a quick introduction about CEEW. We're among Asia's leading policy research institutions. Our work spans multiple facets of sustainability. We work on both issues that are near and medium term, related to energy access, the deployment of large-scale renewables, power sector reform, as well as industrial energy efficiency and competitiveness. We also look at issues of longer-term relevance, such as the modeling of deep decarbonization economy-wide trajectories and assessing climate risk, the impact of climate risks on economies. We also examine the governance-related aspects of sustainability, and our Center for Energy Finance aims to deepen markets, increase transparency, and attract capital to clean energy in emerging economies. So talking about the net zero debate, CW has been deeply involved with shaping this debate in India, including closely coordinating with government entities. And given that the recent announcement of the target by India earlier in COP, in my presentation, I will try to also highlight parameters relevant to the chosen decarbonization trajectory of 2070 net zero during the course of my presentation. So CEW essentially models economy-wide and sectoral decarbonization pathways using the global change analysis modeling framework, which is essentially an integrated assessment tool that models the behavior of and the interactions between energy systems, water, agriculture and land use, climate, and the economy. And in our analysis, we cover the energy-related CO2 emissions in India, which account for around 88% of India's overall GHG emissions, including land use change, and forestry. So in our analysis, we have basically modeled 4 decarbonization trajectories, namely emissions peaking in 2030 and going to net zero in 2050, emissions peaking in 2030 and net zero in 2060, emissions peaking in 2040 and going to net zero in 2070. Now this third trajectory is the closest version to India's announcement earlier at COP. However, India did not announce a peaking year in its net zero commitment. And the last trajectory is emissions peaking in 2050 and going to net zero in 2080. So these four trajectories are modeled considering alternative technology maturity statuses for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. So four levels of technology maturity for CCS and hydrogen, and 4 emissions trajectories gives us 16 pathways that we have analyzed. And basically, when we talk about technological maturity, the labels low and high, yes and no mentioned on the slide essentially indicate whether a specific technology is commercially viable or not. So moving ahead, what does this mean for India's sectoral decarbonization trajectories? Here is a slide that examines the situation for the power sector, which is, of course, the largest sectoral emissions contributor. So each chart indicates the area under each chart sort of represents how sectoral parameters vary under each of the 16 emissions pathways. And while the area under each chart represents these 16 pathways, you'll notice that there are specific line graphs that are also indicated in each chart. The specific line graphs correspond to the 2070 net zero pathway and corresponding to the 4 alternative technological positions that we've considered in this analysis. And the line right at the bottom in the first chart represents the reference scenario that basically represents progress on decarbonization factoring in current policy trajectories. So you would notice that when we talk about electricity generation, India, of course, is a rapidly growing economy with fast economic growth and rates of urbanization. So even in the reference scenario, we see the first chart, electricity generation rising to about 8,000 terawatt hours by 2070 as compared to around 1,300 terawatt hours in 2015. Though this seems large, if we talk about a net zero scenario, particularly 2070, where we're factoring in commercially viable hydrogen, but no CCS, this figure rises to around 17,000 terawatt hours compared to 8,000 in the reference scenario by 2070. So this just illustrates the extent of electrification that would be needed to enable this sort of transition. This is also sort of indicated in other sectoral indicators, such as the total generation of solar capacity that would be required. In the 2070 net zero scenario, where we have commercially viable hydrogen but not commercially viable CCS, installed solar capacity by the year 2070 would total around 5,600 gigawatts as compared to around 1,300 gigawatts in the reference scenario by the same year. For context, India's current installed solar capacity stands at around 45 gigawatts, including both utility scale solar and rooftop solar. So you'll notice the extent of deployment that is needed to achieve the net zero scenario. The same is reflected in other sectoral parameters, such as the deployment of coal, where for the 2070 net zero scenario, coal deployment would have to peak in 2040 and essentially be effectively phased out by 2060. And we'll also need a greater share of nuclear power as compared to the current situation in the country. So that was a snapshot of how it would impact the electricity sector. If I were to look at some of the other major energy-related sectors, in terms of the transport sector, we witness considerably higher electrification as well. So in the net zero scenario of 2070, this requires around 50% electrification of the transport sector and around 26% hydrogen uptake as well. This of course dwarfs the corresponding values in terms of electrification of around 8% in the reference scenario and negligible hydrogen uptake for transportation in the reference scenario. The same applies to the state of the industry sector, where the 2070 net zero scenario would entail electrification to the tune of 64% in the industry and an uptake of around 19% for hydrogen in that sector. And as compared to the reference scenario, these values stand at 27% for electrification and 2% in hydrogen for the year 2070. So essentially, what I want to communicate with these numbers is that a net zero scenario essentially entails an economy-wide transformation of all of these sectors. And this would essentially require policy and regulation to develop conducive ecosystems that can reduce supply-side bottlenecks, that can de-risk investments, that can increase uptake on the demand side, and also marshal the required financial resources to enable this transformation. So for example, can India even sort of muster up appropriate land sites to set up 5,600 gigawatts of solar capacity that's needed by 2070? That is a question that policy and regulation needs to address. Similarly, what kind of incentives are needed, for example, to ensure the uptake of electric mobility to the extent desired? Or what kind of de-risking is required through public capital and in which sectors? So all of these questions need to be answered and require extensive consultations with sectoral experts and industry. And in fact, Tunisia, the approach that is followed by Tunisia in terms of the consultative, iterative process in developing its own long-term strategy can be a worthy exemplar that the Indian context can also emulate in determining its strategy post the announcement of its 2070 target. So further, the point is that while net zero requires a massive transformation, it also entails economy-wide costs. And given these, the developing countries, when they're determining their own net zero trajectories, they must keep various facets of the net zero debate or implications thereof in mind while determining these. And some of these factors that we talked about in the Indian context during the course of our own consultations, I will now just briefly encapsulate. So these are some of the major aspects of the net zero debate that countries must consider while determining their own trajectories, and I'll just briefly touch upon each of these. So the first is that matters of equity and climate justice should explicitly be talked about and emphasized when determining net zero trajectories. So in this case, essentially what that means is that countries that have been historically responsible for cumulative CO2 emissions should also thereby undertake more ambitious decarbonization trajectories going forward. And when we also talk about emissions in the future, we can't overlook China, though of course it has lesser historical emissions. Even considering its existing 2060 target, it would comfortably exceed the cumulative historical and projected emissions among all countries. Therefore, essentially what this means is that in order to promote equity, countries can consider an income-based differentiation where developed countries such as the EU and the USA or developed countries and regions can consider advancing their net zero years. China can also consider advancing its current peaking year, and other emerging economies can then set their net zero targets depending upon their respective country circumstances. And this is because, of course, there are considerable policy costs for attaining net zero targets. At the same time, countries will have to evaluate the feasibility, not just in terms of the technological feasibility or availability of finance, but even, for example, the availability of physical resources, such as having adequate land for deploying specific technologies. However, having said that, net zero also represents an amazing economic opportunity, as some of the speakers touched upon before me, for economic transformation, for developing new economic growth and jobs. In this context, all economies, developed and developing, should aim to set their respective trajectories leading to net zero emissions. Though in this context, I would say that developed countries should take the lead in terms of being more ambitious, advancing their net zero years, which enables developing countries to follow a more gradual glide path in order to also meet their development needs. So these were some of the thoughts that I felt was relevant from the perspective of the Indian experience. And I'll now pass it back to Axel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arjun. And of course, the sheer scale of the challenges in India to get it on a net zero path, yeah, they were very nicely demonstrated. Now I would like to invite Amal to give the civil society perspective. Amal, you have the floor.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you, colleagues. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone. Hope you're all doing well and that you enjoyed, as I did, insights from colleagues from Jordan and India. I'm Amal Ridin, a young climate change negotiator among the Tunisian delegation. I'm a global shaper from Tunis Hub, so I will be sharing my perspective as the hub, and I'll also wear a couple of other hats from World Scouting and from UNICEF's Generation Unlimited Network. Global Shapers Network exists in more than 432 countries with more than 150 countries with more than 430 hubs. And if we can move to the next slide. To speak generally first around Tunisian non-governmental organizations. So right after the revolution, the landscape of NGOs have known great mobilization. So the number of NGOs increased, but also their awareness, their environmental awareness, and their focus on environmental matters have been enhanced, and some of them have climate change as a primary mission. Maybe to name a few of them, I'm cautious of time. We have Youth for Climate Tunisia, ADEC, which stands for Association tunisienne, Association de développement de l'environnement de CRAM, and other online UNFCCC accredited organizations like Samia 21, APNEC, Association de protection de la nature et environnement, ATME, l'Association tunisienne de maîtrise de l'énergie, et de C2D, which stands for Climate Change and Sustainable Development. So also moving to the next slide, and my presentation won't be as technical as the previous presentations, but would rather provide some insights about NGOs, so more of a concrete perspective on how I see. So the Global Shapers Tunis Hub have been around since a decade now, and since 2 years ago, we've established a committee on climate change. So the hub believes that we should make sure that citizens in Tunisia, and more specifically in the city of Tunis, are aware of their potential as a valuable asset in the society. And of course, the Global Shapers Network is an initiative of the World Economic Forum for young people under the age of 30, and we have a great team of various profiles from various backgrounds. As I was mentioning, we had a specific committee on climate change, and maybe to name a few initiatives that we led in this regard. Next slide. So I can mention the Global Shapers Tunis Hub Davos Lab Dialogue. So the concept is to choose one of the most heated thematics and to run a dialogue on that to try to identify what kind of recommendations we could get. So this was run globally from shapers all over more than 100 countries, and we had run 350 dialogues. So Tunis Hub chose to work on net zero or carbon neutrality, and we had as panelists the UNFCCC national focal point, a climate change expert, and Zero Waste Tunisia represented. So, and we exchanged, the dialogue was broadcasted online, so we made it to interact with other interested citizens, and we developed a set of recommendations that I would be happy to share briefly in the next slide. So main highlights that today we think, and that was highlighted in Mr. Samir's intervention, that the current industrial model has reached its limits and that we need to upgrade at this stage, that carbon neutrality achievement would only be possible if all the sectors are mobilized and committed. This is a joint responsibility and is not sector related, and that particularly in Tunisia we thought, or the insights that we got during this dialogue, that the transportation transition is a key area of focus. Next slide, please. We also think that there is a need to introduce a behavioral change in the population mindset. So we think that today there is an urgent need to raise awareness to Tunisian citizen day-to-day or day-by-day consumer behavior, that introducing innovative mechanisms will be key into fostering and finding green alternatives. And last but not least, that net zero is a new paradigm that will heavily count on the transition from industry to services or to the jobs of future, as also highlighted in the Tunisian long-term low emission strategy consultative phase. Moving to the next slide, and so all of these recommendations were fed in a report along from other hubs all over the world. So they contributed to the Youth Recovery Plan, which was launched in International Youth Day in 2021, and the report offers governments a set of recommendations on how we think they should go ahead, and so 40 recommendations to be precise, and the plan calls for stricter environmental policies among other areas. So also on the next slide, another initiative that we will be running in the near future. So we got selected for the Climate Reality project, and we were working on a local version. So it's more of a top-down approach of our Tunisia NDC, starting with a pilot experience in the city of Tunis. So it was inspired from the Tunisian NDC, and we will be addressing locally this. And as you can see, the team that has developed this comes from different backgrounds. Maybe to conclude, and on the next slide, and to see how we see, or maybe more globally, how the NGOs should be involved into the implementation, the development, because I'm aware like most of the development has been already addressed, but we also need to make sure that we follow up on that or on the remaining phases. So to support the development, we think that the role of the NGOs is key into guaranteeing an inclusive process where young people, women, rural areas, persons, and other categories are being included in the process. This will be key to, again, the ownership throughout the way. Also, we need to make sure that this process is resilient and is flexible. In terms of the implementation phase, so I see the role of Tunisian NGOs as key into liaising and helping the implementation on local communities. So we can also support or provide insights to make sure we're having the local mitigation, so not only local adaptation, but also local mitigation. And this can be addressed via some capacity building mechanisms, workshops, events. We need to make sure that the population speaks the same language and they do not see like these numbers are something that do not concern them, but because they're the primary target for this. So, and also the other way around, the intermediation can be into sharing with the focal points what is actually in the field and how we can make sure we're addressing this. And last but not least, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, so a long-term strategy is something big and we're aware of that, but it's always crucial to have like set KPIs and to follow on that via a transparent accountability mechanism. So I am sure that Tunisian NGOs will be following on that and trying to support the efforts toward this. And it goes without saying that throughout all these three main pillars, innovation and thinking out of the box is key to making sure I'm aware and I can guarantee the great potential Council in there with the Tunisian NGOs, but also civil society. And we look forward to be following side by side with the relevant ministry, sectors, and any other stakeholders on the implementation of that. That's it from my side. I tried to be as quick as possible. So next slide should be the thank you slide. So, and please do reach out if you have any other questions. And I look forward to see more concrete outcomes to my country's long-term low-emission strategy. And I'm optimistic when it comes to this regard. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amin. So now we have a few minutes left. So I would invite the virtual participant to ask questions. I see that there is a big room full of virtual participants. So you have the chance to bring in 2-3 questions. So use that chance. Unless if there are no questions, I would ask here the participants to provide, let's say, what are the key messages of this event for the Tunisian long-term strategy? What should Tunisia take as a lesson from the giant country India, from the country Jordan, which is fairly similar in structure and size, and also, of course, how can these high-flying dialogues of WEF be brought down to the people, the young people without jobs in the banlieue de Tunis? So, a few questions there, and I see we get the virtual question. Please raise your question. Good. As long as the question not coming up, I invite Arjun to comment on, what are your recommendations for Tunisia?
Right. Thank you, Axel. So, of course, Tunisia is developing its long-term low-emission strategy. And as I'll take the parallel from the Indian case, that, of course, this requires massive and very ambitious decarbonization. So this would require policymakers to very carefully evaluate for each sector what are the specific policies and regulations needed to address any supply side challenges, or to de-risk investments, or to ensure the uptake of demand in each of the sectors to facilitate the decarbonization. And the other thing is that for all developing countries, domestic financial systems are typically not sufficient, and this would require the linking of investment opportunities with international capital. So at COP26, we've seen enhanced commitments on climate finance, so it is essential that policymakers strive to ensure linking of these opportunities with international capital.
Good. It seems that the virtual question is coming up. So, virtual question, please. Give your name, background, and question. Well, this technology is not working, so I would invite Amin to give. So what do you tell let's say, the people who are really struggling with life and who cannot attend WEF kind processes, to relate to net zero strategy? Well, how would you see that?
Yeah, maybe to be super brief, I think the COVID, or among the COVID's privilege, we've been introduced to a new normal, and I think it's like resources and tools are now more accessible than ever, also sharing best practices and liaising with other networks online. I know it's not as live as having a real life conversation, but I think it's important today. We have a lot of accessible tools, and connectivity is today key into reaching resources. So it does not have to be happening in a meeting room at COP26 necessarily, but we can always find a mean. And maybe from a young person perspective, it's always important to liaise with other young persons and to try to make it happen, to make your voices heard. And I'm sure there will be some responsiveness and to come to this. At least that was my experience in Tunisia.
Thank you. And now I see the virtual room. So last 1.5 minutes left. Virtual question, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for these amazing and informative presentations. So my question is, what is crucial for Tunisia to make in terms of public policies and infrastructural changes to be able to benefit and profit from a potential sustainable technological transition, so in terms of infrastructural changes and also public policies? Thank you.
Who among the panel would like to take that question? I have some views on this, but
I can take the question.
Yes,
Thank
please.
You. So thank you for that question. So like I mentioned very briefly in my remarks when Axel prompted me, that, you know, the money is available globally. It is generating bankable investment opportunities for that money to flow. So policy and regulation in Tunisia must ensure bankable projects in each of the respective sectors, say power or mobility or industry, to ensure that capital that is available internationally can come and flow into Tunisia to actually facilitate the decarbonization. So that is one key area that policymakers can work on.
Thank you, Arjun. So with that, I would like to close today's event. I thank the virtual participants and everyone who was standing with us. And it's a new experience for me. I've done 25 years of side events, I must say, and I'm now very frank, it has never been so difficult to organize a side event as at this COP, and I would hope that the organizers in the next COP learn their lessons.